we are going to take a look at the next step in the fulfillment of the promises. It's a pretty amazing story because we're going to find out how Exodus comes a full 400 years after Genesis, but never misses a beat of the song. I mean, it's just like you picked up with the very next book, right? 400 years later, boom, right there again. Number two, we're going to find out when you find out what Yahweh really means, you can only say it with absolute reverence. Number three, why Moses never won Husband of the Year, if you read the reading carefully enough. And number four, why a recent survey of firstborns indicates a strong preference for pass-overs versus pass-throughs. So, let's get after it. And you might say, wait a minute, we're done with Genesis. And the trouble is that you're really not, because every time we start a book, and we're going to do this a lot, when you start a book, one of the things we're going to do is by taking a look at the previous verse. And the previous verse in Genesis, and this presupposes this divine connection and this coherent thought, right? But when you get to Genesis chapter 50, verse 26, which is the very last verse in Genesis, in fact, these are the last 8 words in English, at least. Joseph was placed in a coffin in Egypt. The way that prepares us for Exodus is this. When we look at those words, we don't just consider them some kind of throwaway historical footnote, but we recognize that there's something really heavily theological going on here. And when you take that statement and you evaluate the promises in light of it, and you have to do that in order to understand any statement, you realize, let's see now, how are we doing in terms of land, nation, and leader? According to those 8 words, how are we doing? Not so good, right? We're in the, number one, we're in the wrong land. Oops, right? Egypt. In terms of a nation, we've actually only got 70 people. Ain't much of a nation. And leader, how's our leader doing? Dead, like really dead, okay? Now, that's especially meaningful to us because now you all know who Joseph is. You know he's a lot more than just a guy. He is the guy. He is the picture of the leader. And so what you've got going on here at the end of chapter 50 is very similar to what we saw in Genesis 23, where Abraham had to bury Sarah, right? And we said, what does that story contribute? And what it contributes is, look, he is heir of all the land, but he owns a little tiny slice of it there, right? And he got swindled doing that. So have the promises been fulfilled yet? And although the knee-jerk responses want to say, yes, 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 the answer is no, no, no. Not yet. Right? They will be, but not yet at all. So when we get to the end of Genesis, are the promises here yet? And the answer is, we're just barely getting started, right? But here's the good news. When we come into Exodus is going to come along and take us a major step toward, let's see, land, nation, or leader, one of the 3. But not all of them, one of them. Now, if I ask you to choose or to vote, before you do that, recognize that you could find some pretty good reasons for all 3, but there's really only one that's right. So tell me, why is land not the right answer for what Exodus is about? Exactly right. I mean, they get out of Egypt, so you might think, wow, they're on their way, but they don't get there, right? So they don't get into the land. And you might look at the leader and think, oh, that's pretty good. Moses is a great leader, but we already learned in the last book there's a good reason why Moses ain't a perfect picture of the leader. Can you tell me why? From what? Yeah, that's true. He does disobey God. That's right. But there's something else that kind of disqualifies him from being the leader. Well, maybe, although God uses murderers like Paul, there's still some other disqualifying thing. It's from a tribe of Levi, right? And the kings have to be from a tribe of Judah. Yeah, so he's not that. So by process of elimination, you say, I'm going to guess this one. Okay? Yeah, that's right. So what's going to happen here is we're going to take 2.5 million individuals and form them into one nation, right? To fulfill Genesis chapter 12 and verse, 12, 1, 2, and 3. Which part of the passage is this? Genesis 12. 1 is the land, Genesis 12. 3 is the leader, and this is 2. Okay? So, here's a little bit of a chronological layout. Most of Genesis happens there within a couple hundred years of Abraham, around 2000 BC. And then Exodus happens here with Moses around 1450. Within a month of that, Leviticus comes along. Within 38 more years, Numbers comes along, and then comes Deuteronomy. So it's interesting that once you get to Moses here, all of a sudden this revelation starts popping up everywhere, right? It's like, wait a minute, why did we have such a big gap there? And there's a fairly easy, simple reason why we have a 400-year gap. Can you tell me what it is? Something has to happen, very, very practical. What is it? We have to grow from 70 to 2.5 million. Right? So God, it's not like God's forgotten. He's just waiting for this whole thing to happen. And once we get 2.5 million people here, then all of a sudden, man, it really starts to explode. And so the focus here around Moses really takes off, and God starts fulfilling promises in a really big way. So let me give you a little outline. And I just want you to know that typically as a student, when I was, if I were you taking notes and I saw an outline, I wouldn't think very much of it. And I don't have you do busy work like memorize outlines most of the time, but every once in a while there's one that's pretty good, and this one is. It may not seem like it yet, but by the time we're done on Monday, you'll understand that this is a really important outline because it flows. First of all, God buys the people or wins them, not with money, but with blood. God redeems them. And then he's actually going to marry them, as it were. He's going to enter into a covenant relationship, and he's going to form the people into a nation by that covenant relationship. And this is where the essence of it happens, and it's really going to happen on Monday for us, but that's where it happens. And then the chapters 25 to 40 are all filled with a discussion of the tabernacle. But that's because this is God's house, and he's now moved into the neighborhood. So there's a kind of a natural progressive flow here. God kind of romantically wins his bride, and then he marries her, and then he moves in. So there's a easy progression. Okay? All right, so let's jump right into the text and into chapter 1, where God buys or wins, or if you want to be, theological, redeems a people to himself. And that's because they don't really know him very well. You're going to find that emphasis here in the first 11 chapters. God introduces himself and separates the people from Egypt. And you might think, well, that's kind of dumb. Doesn't everybody know God? And the answer is no, they don't, right? Because we've had this 400 years where people have forgotten God and they don't know him. And so a lot of the emphasis on these first 11 chapters is God saying, hey, here I am. Emphasis on I am. Get it? Cute, huh? So, so let's take a look at chapter 1. The need for deliverance. And we asked the question, why would the nation want to stay in Egypt? But really the question should be reversed. Why would they want to leave Egypt? In fact, if you knew what you were talking about back here, about the difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the map, you would say, over here on the left is civilization, and over on the right is a third world country. You might think, well, gosh, who wouldn't want to leave Egypt? That's terrible down there, and the land flowing with milk and honey. But wait a minute. At this time period, up there in the land of Canaan, or Israel, it is a third world country. It's backward, it's dangerous, it's pagan, it's pretty disgusting. And down here in Egypt, there is beauty galore. What I'm talking about is this. If you go to almost any major museum in the world, Philadelphia, or New York, or Chicago, or Berlin, or London, almost anywhere you go, you can find beautiful treasures from Egypt. Because everybody in the world steals stuff from Egypt because they have so much beautiful stuff. I remember in the Philadelphia Museum one time, it's one of the first times I saw it, looking at some Egyptian sandals, and they were gold, and they were just incredibly beautiful. And some more jewelry was intricate and beautiful. And I thought, man, this is 4,000 years old, right? And imagine what it actually looked like when it was produced. I mean, this is just really, really beautiful stuff. And then you think about the architecture, and you look at that, and you think, well, that's okay. That's 3D picture. Doesn't look like that, but back then it did, right? Until Napoleon's gunners in the 1800s, whenever they were, shot the face off the Sphinx, it was probably a pretty good looking thing. Right? And the pyramids themselves, before 4,000 years of erosion, looked really good. And to be at this place was to be at the height of security and culture and safety. I mean, this is a really, really good place. And so God has to give them a reason to get out of town. And the reason he gives them to get out of town is, number one, right, the slavery, and number two, if that's not bad enough, then the death of the baby boys, which just kind of like pushes them over the edge, right? It's like, okay, we're enough of this bricks without straw, but we can't handle the death of the children, so we got to get out of here. Otherwise, they probably would have stayed there forever. So that leads us then to chapters 2, 3, and 4, the introduction of God to the deliverer Moses. So this is where God is going to introduce himself to, first of all, to Moses. And you know the story, you know the picture. There's a bush that's burning. It's not unusual to have a bush burning. What's unusual is that the bush doesn't burn up. So after watching for like 6 hours, Moses thinks, I think I'm going to go check that thing out, right? And over there, he, of course, meets God. And when he goes over to it, God begins to speak to him out of the burning bush and tells him to go back and rescue his people. And Moses has a pretty legitimate question, and he says, maybe I will turn it on, turn on the text here. God says, I want you to go and bring them out of the land of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God doesn't answer it immediately in so many words, but through this whole passage, if we could just summarize it, it would be something like this. Moses, it's not who you are, it's what? It's who I am, right? That makes the difference. I will be with you, and it's who I am. So eventually Moses gets down here and says, well, okay, well, who shall I say sent me? Right? Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they say, what is his name? Well, what do I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now, that statement always just struck me funny. Like, I am who I am? What in the world does that mean? Well, when you understand what this name really does mean, as we said before, you can always say it with real reverential respect. So let me explain the name to you, okay? In English, we say I am. In Hebrew, we would say Jehovah, or better, Yahweh. Jehovah is kind of an anglicized Yahweh, okay? And in order to understand Yahweh, I'm going to teach you 3 other Hebrew words that you may already know in order to contrast it. Now, if you think that's hard, it's not. I could give you 50 names. Literally, I could give you 50 other names for God in the Old Testament. I'm only going to give you 3. Amen? Unless you want the other 47. Yeah, no, not for the test. You don't want the other 47. 3 is enough, but I want you to know all 3 of these because these are just basic things you should know. First one is Elohim, which you've heard before, and notice that I put the small lowercase g there, and that's correct because it could be used for a false god. Okay, and sometimes it is talking about the Elohim of the Canaanites, right? So it doesn't just mean the true God. Nope, Elohim does not mean creator. It means the mighty God or generic God. Right? And even can be applied to people at certain points in Psalm 82, verse 6, but that's another story. But anyway, at this point, a God, right? It could be the true God, could be a false God. We'll come back to the creator thing in a second. Then there's El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. Remember we talked about this in Genesis chapter 17. God appeared to, this is the chapter where Abraham laughs. It says God appeared to him as El Shaddai, right? And said, walk before me and be blameless. And then the third one I want you to know here is the word Adonai, and maybe you've heard that one before. It has the idea of Lord or master or boss or the guy in charge. So those are 3 names we will use. You probably should know. But the 4th one is this, Yahweh, and it's always translated small caps Lord. Now notice the difference between Adonai and Yahweh. It's always lowercase Lord for Adonai, and it's always small caps for Yahweh, because your English Bible editors want you to know when it's Yahweh and when it's Adonai, because it makes a huge difference. Now, let's take a little quick break here, and let's talk about your journables just for a second. Did anybody notice a difference when you got to Genesis chapter 2 in the way God was referenced? Yeah, the Lord God, right? And it was small caps, Lord. In Genesis 1, it's always Elohim. In Genesis chapter 2, it's Yahweh Elohim. It's the Lord God, right? Because we're talking about the transcendent creator God in chapter 1, and then we're talking about the God who comes close and touches and creates and breathes and walks in chapter 2. Talk more about that later. But this is a difference between Elohim and Yahweh. Now, the bigger one is this, that all of those are generic titles. Like for me, generic titles would be, professor, husband, father, whatever, brother, okay, son. But Yahweh is actually a personal name. Now, for me, then you get down to Chris here, all of a sudden you get down to a personal name, right? Much, much more personal. And the truth is that even among our names that we use with each other, those names signify the closeness of the relationship. For example, if you go talk to our president, how do you address him? Hello, Dr. White, right? Nobody goes up to him and says, hey, Thomas, right? I hope, right? But some people call him Thomas, and if you call him Thomas, it's probably because you're one of his friends or his peers, right? So the difference between us approaching him, we'd say Dr. White, his friends probably call him Thomas, and I'm pretty sure that his wife, Joy, has other names for him, unknown to us, that I frankly don't even want to know, okay? That she uses that are only for, between the husband and wife. There's probably silly little nicknames. But the same thing is true for you, right? When you first introduce yourself, you give your full name maybe, right? But your friends know you by another name, and your family may know you by some really embarrassing nickname. Am I right here? Does anybody want to share one of those? No. Because that silly little nickname is something that just has some family history or something to it, and something you only use with your closest friends. Right? So what I'm trying to say here ultimately is that this name Yahweh is a really special personal name of God that only his close friends who are in covenant relationship are allowed to call him. The pagans, the Canaanites, do not call him Yahweh. This is his covenantal name that his children Israel call him. Okay? So it's really, really special because of two things then. And the first one is this. When we say I am or Yahweh, there are two big facets to the meaning of it. It is a personal name here that means, first of all, self-existent one. Now you might say, where does that come from? Well, here's where it comes from. It does not mean, or it's opposed to, I began or I came to be. Right? I am. If you go anywhere on the eternal timeline, eternity past, I am there. I didn't begin. You go to eternity future, I am there. Okay? So let me use an illustration here from geometry. I hope you don't hate geometry. But I'm going to put three different figures up here. That one is called a what? A line segment. That one is called a ray. That one is called a line. Okay? Now, just for fun here, let's talk about stuff in this room. Let's talk about all these little scepter pencils here. Right? If we were to look at them and put them on one of those three objects, which one represents their lifespan? The line segment, right? They had a beginning, they will have an end someday. Right? This phone, where does it fit? Line segment, right? Had a beginning, had an end.
It's got a good case.
You think so? You think it's that good? What if I take the case off? No, okay. Right? What about the bottle of water? Water. The bottle of water. Which one? Yeah, line segment, right? It's going to come to an end. Right? So is there anything in the room that doesn't fit on the top object? Yeah. The only thing is us, right? And which one do we fit on? With a ray, yeah. Right? Even if you're an unbeliever, everybody is going to live. Every person is going to live forever somewhere. Right? So everything in the room fits on the top except us. Let's expand this out to the rest of the cosmos. Is there anything that doesn't fit on one of the top two lines? What's the only thing that doesn't fit there? It is God, right? And the point is this: everything else has a beginning, everything else has a cause. He's the only one who doesn't have a cause, therefore he is self-existent. So, as we said before, eternity past, I am there, now I am here, in the future I am there, or as we say elsewhere in the Bible, the one who was and who is to come celebrates this whole idea of everything else had a beginning, everything else started, and I started everything else except for me, right? So therefore, God is the ultimate causer. He's the ultimate powerful one. But that's not the end of it. That's just the first part. There's a second part, and it's right here in Genesis 3:15. Notice the word also. This is pretty important, right? God also said, like, here's another part of the name. God also said, you must say this to Israelites, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name. What's he trying to say? This whole idea of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the promises which I have made to them are a significant part of my name. So let's say it like this. The I am means I am the self-existent one, and I am the God who keeps his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Or, for short, we'll just say this: God is the powerful promise keeper. Right? Because if you're self-existent, you create everything else, you're pretty powerful. And if you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you're the one who's made those promises. So whenever you see Yahweh, whenever you see the Lord, whenever you see that name, always in the back of your mind, you should be thinking, can't ever get away from those promises, all right? So, let's go on then to the next major section where God separates these people from Egypt. He's going to pull them out. And there's a background to chapters 5 to 10, and it's found in chapters 5 and 6 and 7. Now, watch this development carefully, okay? In 5, 6, and 7, there's going to be a theme that's consistent, and the theme is nobody knows Yahweh. Right? Moses is coming back, and he's going to tell everybody, hey, Yahweh sent me, and everybody's going to say, who? Right? In chapter 5, right here, Pharaoh doesn't know Yahweh, and we're not surprised by that, but Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, that I should obey him by releasing Israel? I do not know the Lord, and I will not release Israel. I do not like green eggs and ham, Sam I am. I think that's where Dr. Seuss got it from, right? From Pharaoh, right here. But Pharaoh doesn't know who he is, and we're not surprised by that. But he's not the only one, because in chapter 6, the Israelites don't know who he is. So let's take a look at chapter 6. And this one's so important, we're going to look at the whole paragraph, right? Now this is pretty interesting. God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, or read it in Hebrew for me, as what? El Shaddai. I appeared to them as El Shaddai. But by my name, Yahweh, I was not known to them. Now, if you don't read Hebrew, or you don't know how to read your English Bibles, you might think, okay, no big deal. Except that we've already said something this morning, this afternoon, that contradicts that. What contradicts that statement that we have already talked about today? Genesis 2, right? Genesis 2, the Lord God, right? And in fact, if you go to Genesis 12 and 13 and 14 and 15, you will see Lord in small caps used in reference to Abraham. So you have to either say, contradiction, or maybe God's smarter than I am, and maybe there's something else going on here. I need to look a little deeper. And of course, that's where we need to go. Figure it out for me. Make my day. In fact, if you answer this question, I'll think about letting you out of here early today, okay? If you can do this well, little incentive. Based upon what I've already told you today, how can this be true if, in fact, the name Yahweh does show up in Genesis 12 to 22? In what sense can God say, I was known to them as El Shaddai, but by name Yahweh, I wasn't known to them?
Moses wrote the books. Moses knew God's name. And God's the one that told Moses everything he wrote still could go back and tell Moses the story, like, and then Yahweh, like, then I did this.
Right, so Moses would know it, but Abraham didn't know that. Okay, no, that's a possibility. But let's just say that you can read those words and take them at face value, that Abraham is there walking with Yahweh. And let's just say that he does know that. There's a sense in which could still be true, that Abraham would have recognized the name Yahweh, but not really known it. Do you understand in what sense that could be? What does Yahweh mean? For sure, Yahweh means the powerful promise keeper. Not ringing any bells? He hadn't kept his promises yet, right? He had not kept his promises yet. So maybe they kind of knew the name, but they didn't really know the name. They hadn't experienced the name, right? And the reason I say that is, look what happens here. I established my covenant or my promises with them to give them the land of Canaan, in which they were living as resident aliens. Now again, that phrase, resident aliens, takes us all the way back to Genesis chapter, well, let's see, what was that chapter where Sarah died? Chapter 23, right? And he said to Ephron the Hittite, look, I'm an alien and a stranger, right? So we're looking back there at that point where it was clear he was heir of everything but didn't own anything. God had not kept the promises. I made my promises to them, but they were still living like resident aliens. So I've heard their groaning, and I've remembered my promises. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am Yahweh. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their hard labor. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, right? And I will take you to myself for a people, and I will become your God. Then you will know that I am Yahweh, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as possession. I am a powerful promise keeper. You see it here? So what he's saying was, man, up until then I made promises, but I never kept them to them. But now I'm about ready in a big way to start keeping some promises to them. So that's 5. Pharaoh doesn't know. Chapter 6, the Israelites don't know. Chapter 7, then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I extend my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from among them. So the big theme here in the background is simply this: nobody knows Yahweh. So what's going to happen next then in the flow, in the literary development of the book, is 2D, God is going to reveal himself to Israel and Pharaoh. Now, if you were God, how would you reveal yourself to Israel and Pharaoh? In the literary development of the book, what happens next? Well, they're going to find him out, and they're going to find out about him through this. You know, you think, now wait a minute. How in the world do the plagues demonstrate who he is? Well, they do in a really powerful way. So let me see if I can explain it to you. And let me just say, first of all, when you look at the plagues, there is a lot going on here. This is a very carefully crafted section. And in fact, there is a whole lot more going on here than I have time to tell you about today or that I even know about. But I just want you to notice some observations here. Notice that, first of all, the top blue row, right? Blood, flies, and hail. For these, there is a AM warning, a warning in the morning. On the next row, frogs, cattle, and locusts, there's a warning, but it doesn't tell us when it is. And 3, 6, and 9, there is no warning. Now, why? What's the point? Frankly, I'm not sure, except that I see that there's a lot of symmetry here, and I think if you took some time and studied plagues, you'd probably find out a whole lot more interesting stuff. But what I do want to tell you is this, and say that when you look at a number of these, they are really, really powerful, and more than just powerful, they are insulting. The reason why they're insulting is because they strike right at the heart of Egyptian theology, of Egyptian deities. Right? And the first one I'm talking about, of course, is the blood. Let me explain to you why. When you take a look at the map of Egypt, you see everything to the left of the Red Sea there, and that's all Egypt. You say, wow, that's a massive amount of territory. Yes, it is. That's true. Trouble is, most of it is sand and gnats. Right? And if we take away the part where you can't live, then Egypt looks about this big. Right? The only reason you can live there is because the Nile brings into the desert life itself through the water. And you can only live in like a mile each side of the Nile, and otherwise you can't live. So this is why the Nile becomes celebrated and worshipped as a life-giving source that is a god. And if God himself, Yahweh, comes along and turns it to blood, then take a look where you go in Egypt for water. There's nowhere, right? And so immediately through this plague, the Egyptians say, wow, I don't know who this Yahweh person is, but he is really powerful because he overcame our God in the Nile, right? And then the next one I want to share with you is this one, the darkness. And you don't have to watch very many Egyptian mummy movies to know about the god of the sun, right? Whose name is Ra. Yeah, we all know that, right? And here's a picture from National Geographic of an annual ceremony where the Pharaoh right here, who is a god himself, but not as big a god as Ra, comes before Ra, symbolized here by the little guy on this boat, right? And notice these little sun discs right here in his headdress. So what he's doing is he's coming to worship Ra and to have Ra infuse him with deity that he needs to keep going as a god, okay, in this festival. So imagine when we come back here, you often see him symbolized that way, or even slightly more modern 3D ways like this kind of guy, okay? But you always got the sun back there and the bird head, right? Imagine what it's like then if, well, just think back to the big eclipse, right? When the big eclipse came, it got a little bit darker, got a little bit cooler, it was kind of neat, we all knew it was coming, so it wasn't that big a deal. But what if none of us knew it was coming, and the lights went completely out? What would you do? I mean, think about it seriously. What would you do? We would not celebrate. You would totally panic, right? All of us would, like, oh my goodness, what? And then add to that, your God has just disappeared, not just a sun. This is a really unsettling thing.
I couldn't tell from the passage when I was reading it. Do you think that the darkness was just the sun, or like all methods of light as well, like fire and everything else that they would use to light their home?
I think it's directed mainly at the sun because it's a theological thing here, not just a artificial light source. So there's darkness, but then the next one, of course, is the death of the firstborn. And again, this one is also against the deities of Egypt because right here in this picture, again from National Geographic, you've got the big Pharaoh up there and the little Pharaoh taking him out to war, showing him how to command the troops. And each of these guys were gods, the big god and the next god. And so when you take this next god through that death of the firstborn, these things are a huge insult to the gods of Egypt. And it's waking everybody up, not just the power of it, but also the theology of it as well. So by the time you're finished with this, you're saying to yourself, wow, whoever this Yahweh person is, he's really powerful, and he's doing this in order to keep his promises to Israel. So who is this guy? Well, he's a powerful promise keeper. And another way to say that is simply this: he is Yahweh. So let me take a look very quickly at this last one about the 10th plague or the Passover and see if we can figure out what it means. And you know that you put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and a lot of people are eager to say, whoa, if you connect those dots, I see what God's getting at. And you and I see that, but that's because we know what the cross is. Put yourself back in the Egyptian times, 1,500 years before the Romans ever come and invent this as a form of execution. And no one's going to see that. And I don't think they were meant to, but what would they see? Well, what they would see is this lamb, right? And what they would see, well, put yourself in the place of the firstborn child. And you know that if your dad hasn't put the blood of the lamb on top of the post, by the time the sun goes down, the death angel is not going to pass over, it's going to pass through, and you're going to die. Right? So you wake up in the morning and you say, hey, Dad, can't we go sacrifice that lamb now? Right? And Dad says, no, we got some chores to do. We got to rotate the tires in the chariot, and then maybe we'll get to it. And so it's like 11 o'clock, and say, hey, Dad, can we kill that lamb now? He says, no, it's almost time for lunch. Okay, all right, you're going for lunch. After lunch is over, hey, Dad, can we kill the lamb now? I want to take a nap. I'm kind of tired, right? So 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun's sinking down, right? And how are you feeling at this point? You say, Dad, can we kill that lamb now, right? And he says, why are you so agitated about this? You say, look, I don't understand this, but I understand this, that if the lamb dies, I get to live, right? And that's all you have to know. You don't have to understand all this stuff about Calvary and all this sort of thing, but you do have to understand that if there's this innocent substitute that takes away your sin, that takes the penalty, that dies in your place, you don't have to. And so the basics here, again, of substitutionary atonement are just reinforced over and over and over again. And collectively, for the people who had enough faith to take the blood of the lamb and apply it to their house, this becomes a redemptive moment for them and signals their redemption as they leave Egypt. So this is what's celebrated in the Passover. This is what Jesus takes up on the Last Supper and transforms it into even something more meaningful.